Well, North Korea presents a specific challenge because Kim Jong-il, the late leader of the country, used to actually say that he wanted to surround North Korea in a fog, make it impenetrable to the outside world so that it would be hard to understand its vulnerabilities and its weaknesses. To some degree, that's very much still true, but it's also beginning in small ways to at least allow some bit of exposure to the outside world, to allow researchers, scholars, some occasional NGOs, and of course the odd journalists now and then to come in and poke around. So we're beginning to get some greater sense of the place. But I've often felt that whether we're writing about China or writing about North Korea, that you have to go in with a sense of humility about what you can really understand from a week or a month or a year. Ironically, the longer I lived in China, and I lived there for 8 years, the more I came to be aware of all that I didn't know and all of the questions that I still had to answer. I mean, just literally, you become aware of all of the layers that you're just beginning to unpack. And I think if you lose that, then you begin to make some of the kind of classic mistakes of an analyst. Well, on some level, China and North Korea bear some obvious similarities in the sense that China was coming out of this period of total isolation, ideological seclusion. It was very wary of the outside world. At the end of the Cultural Revolution, it was really in a sort of state of, it had really fallen apart. It had taken itself apart. And then they made the decision that they said, we're going to try to maintain political power, but then open up economic growth. And for years, China has actually made that case to the North Korean leadership that you could try this, where you still hold on to the political monopoly on power, but you've also begun to try to raise the standard of living for your people. And for years, North Korea has resisted that. In fact, I got some good advice when I started talking to the North Korean government about going and reporting on the place. I thought, well, maybe I should talk to them about my experience in China, bring them a copy of the book. And some friends who really understand the byways of North Korean government officials said, terrible idea, because the North Koreans are very, they have this incredibly complicated relationship with China where they have put off that advice. They're really wary about any kind of sense of Chinese influence or control. In fact, the word reform, which is such a sort of centerpiece of Chinese political language, is really not allowed in Pyongyang. You're not allowed to talk about reform. You're allowed to talk about certain measures that have been taken, but you're not supposed to talk about reform. It sounds too much like the Chinese model. Yeah, very much so. I've found over the years that whether or not you're writing for somebody who is brand new to the subject, or if you're writing for a subject matter expert, that sometimes the thing that both audiences are craving is some sense of what it actually feels like to look at the world through the eyes of these people who we might not otherwise have a chance to meet. And so great scholars, for instance, can know everything about the political culture of a country, everything about the history, but they may be circumscribed in their ability to actually go there and spend time with people and try to capture what their lives are like. And obviously for ordinary folks, for all of us, it's hard to do that. And so having the privilege really to go in as a writer means that the first thing I'm always trying to do is to render what the world likes, what the world looks like through the experiences of people whose lives are very different than our own. So in North Korea, that can mean, what does it actually feel like to be the person in the North Korean government whose job is to watch Donald Trump's Twitter feed and understand it? And it just so happens that I met that person when I was there and spent a week with him. And so that kind of thing feels like perhaps adding a little bit to what we know about a country that we generally are trying to describe from far away. Well, I've always basically just wanted to be a documentarian in whatever term that applies. And I started out, I did some documentary film in school, I did photography. I worked as a photographer at the very beginning when I was just getting out of college. I loved it, but I was a terrible photographer. But I always wrote. and I'd written ever since I was a kid, and I always basically knew I wanted to be a writer. And the New Yorker is a funny place where I spend my days. The New Yorker is journalism in the truest sense of reporting as assiduously as possible, but we also try to lend things some literary shape and try to put it into a broader context than what you usually get out of daily events. So in some sense, the truest, most honest description of what I do is that I'm a reporter, full stop. I go places, talk to as many people as I possibly can, and come back and try to deliver their stories. Well, I have a working title. It's called American Archipelago. And it's about the experience of the United States that feels to me like it is divided across a series of scattered islands. Rather than us being one coherent landmass, it feels often like we are inhabiting very different spaces. And we can't always communicate with each other very well. And we're obviously divided in some dramatic ways. And that's how it looks to me and feels to me. I went to Papua New Guinea a few years ago and for a reporting project, and one of the things I discovered when I was in Papua New Guinea is that it's the country with the greatest linguistic diversity in the world, 860 languages. And so you have people who live quite literally within sight of each other, but the terrain is so dramatic, so rugged, and life is harsh, that in many ways people quite literally can't communicate with each other. They just have mutually unintelligible languages and dialects. And as exotic as it sounds, I'm not sure we're in much of a different situation right now in the United States, where people can live within a few miles of each other and have almost nothing that they can find to consider a common basis. I worked in West Virginia for a while, and if you go to West Virginia today, there are parts of West Virginia where the average life expectancy for a man is like in the middle 60s. And you step over the border into Virginia, you get to Fairfax County, and men will live on average 18 years longer. It's wild that you have these two things juxtaposed. And in some ways it's such an obvious fact about our life that we don't really draw attention to it, except that it's become the defining fact of our politics and also of our interactions with each other. So I can probably, without having to go all that far from Washington, D.C., I can sort of draw that into sharper relief.